Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host, COVID-free, we hope just confirmed, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. How are you, Tim?
I'm very well, Brian, now that I have waited forever to get my COVID test, but finally got out of there and on to more fun things like this podcast. Happy
Yes.
holidays.
Happy holidays to you. Happy holidays to everybody out there. We're recording this December 17. This is going to go up sometime likely right before Christmas. And this will be the last episode from us this calendar year. And so, as we teased the last time, this is going to be, we are going to stick with our year end top stories of the year format that we did last year. So, this is going to be top sanctions and export controls and international trade stories of 2021. We have a lot to cover. We're going to do this lightning round style like we did last year as well. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So we won't delay. We're going to jump right into it in a second. Before we do the normal warnings at the outset here that we're not giving legal advice. We're not sharing any confidential information, and any and all views and comments that you hear are solely those of me and Mr. O'Toole. And if you disagree with them, blame us. Please check out Embargoed anywhere you get your pod content. Please subscribe. Please
You
spread
could
the
give
word.
give a subscription as a holiday gift.
Yes, yeah, a little stocking stuffer, a subscription to
Exactly.
Embargoed. It won't cost you much, so
Exactly.
we would certainly recommend you considering that. But with that, I'm going to do a very quick overview of the roadmap here. I'm not going to get into too much detail to spoil the fun, but running through the 10, we're going to do top 10 again in no particular order. Although we kind of have some things that tie together as we go. So I'll run through the 10 issues that we're going to cover, and then maybe Tim and I will reflect very briefly before we dive in. But so in order, here we go. We're gonna talk about hitting the reset button. You can all guess what that might mean. We're going to talk about some successful court challenges that maybe have something to do with the hitting of the reset button. We're going to talk about China, China, China. You know, if you're an embargo listener, that we're never going to skimp on China content. We're going to talk about the fact that there is no JCPOA 2.0 and probably never will be at this point. We're going to get into virtual currency and ransomware, Russia. We're going to talk about sort of the turbulent political times we're living in and how that has spawned some brand new sanctions programs and has perhaps expanded and revitalized some older sanctions programs. We're going to talk about the DPA for Huawei's CFO, which we covered not too long ago, but hit on that once again. We're going to talk about what's going on with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which this year on the sanctions front has not been a whole heck of a lot. And then we're going to finish up by focusing on a couple of thematic and substantive, um, sort of points of focus for U.S. foreign policy generally, but also on the sanctions front, namely anti-corruption, democracy, and human rights. And then we'll maybe cover a few odds and ends at the end with some honorable mentions. But that is the roadmap. That's what we're going to cover today. And again, we're going to do this in lightning round fashion. So these are mostly topics. These are pretty much all topics that we've talked about at some point or another during the course of the year. So this will be familiar, but we do think as we take stock of what has transpired this year, an eventful year, no doubt, given that we began our year by reflecting on what had happened on the Capitol Hill on January 6th and the inauguration of President Biden, and a lot of topsy-turvy events happening in January. And to think here we are, we've almost made it. We're 2 weeks away from the end of the year. Yeah, quite a year. And I will reiterate what I said last time. I am certainly looking forward to personally to turning the calendar to 2022. And yeah, before we get started, Tim, any other thoughts?
I think if we had to give our predictions for what would happen in 2021, remaining with a new variant of COVID that is kind of spreading like wildfire would not have been among our predictions as to the end of 2021. But I do hope that 2022 turns out better, that there are no insurrections and no more variants of concern.
Yeah, in case anyone's wondering, we are on the record on Embargoed as being anti-insurrection, anti-coup, pro-democracy, and anti-COVID. So just in
Yeah,
case anyone's keeping tabs out there, I think
right.
those are we'll put our necks out as wholeheartedly supporting those positions and yeah, agree with what Tim said.
For
I don't
those
know
of
that we
you enjoying a beverage at home, that's the scorecard. Pro democracy, anti COVID, anti insurrection.
Yes, exactly. Anti-treason. So, without further delay, then we will pause for the lightning round sound effect at the outset, and we're going to get into our top 10 for the year. So, number one, as I said, hitting the reset button. So, what does that mean? I think those compliance nerds out there are very familiar with the concept of tone at the top when it comes to running your compliance programs. And I think that that is really what we're talking about here with the new administration taking over in January, notably with the Treasury review of U.S. sanctions policy, which we covered at some length in October when that was released, with a number of the other actions that happened sort of in the first few months of the Biden administration, jettisoning some programs that we were anticipating going away and some policies that we were anticipating going away. I'll let Tim comment on those because some of those are his favorites. But it is just it is, I think, in a meaningful way, we have seen, certainly in the sanctions realm, but more broadly, I think in the foreign policy and international trade realm, some of the tenets that we saw in the Treasury sanctions policy review, hoping to achieve more clarity with the way that the U.S. is deploying this tool, hoping to assess and make sure that that sanctions are being deployed when there is um, it's fit for purpose. There's not just sort of an aimless or undirected attempt to deploy sanctions. Thinking about the impact assessment, both on the stated goals and also collateral impact that it has um, on sort of innocent bystanders in allied countries and the like, working multilaterally with our allies, and also, making sure that our policy in the U.S. can be understood, enforced, and if needed, revised. And I think that those are things that we were anticipating to some degree, but I think that in our view, I think that has pulled through in many different respects. But again, sort of using the OFAC or the Treasury Sanctions Policy Review as kind of the lead talking point on that. I think you see that we have seen that throughout not just the sanctions realm, but in other areas of international trade in the U.S. and foreign policy, and would anticipate that that's going to continue and pull through into 2022 and beyond. So with that, I'll stop and toss it to Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all that. I think very quickly, one of my biggest observation about kind of the reset button is that the 4 years that preceded 2021 were really a time where even sanctions policy, and maybe even particularly sanctions policy, was not done by consensus. I think before 2016, or before 2016, that generally was true. Like I don't think many of our sanctions policies were controversial. Most were bipartisan. Most, to the extent that Congress passed on them, they would go through Congress by wide margins, sometimes unanimous margins. I think from 2017 to 2020, that wasn't quite true, at least in many of the areas, and some of them we'll talk about, in just a second, because they were the subject of litigation. But even so, I think that the collateral consequences, just to pick an example of sanctions programs, I think it has been there's been a wide consensus before 2016 that humanitarian trade should not be the subject of sanctions and should not really be interfered with by sanctions, and the agencies would go out of their way to try and stop that. I think that, as its name suggests, maximum pressure, which was the policy for 4 years, was designed to kind of skirt at the margins of that. They didn't take on humanitarian trade directly, but there was a lot of humanitarian trade that was stopped during those 4 years, particularly in Iran, in Venezuela, in other sanctioned countries that the U.S. was interfering with in fact, even if not in policy, that the current administration has pulled back on. And so I think that it is much more of a sanctions by consensus. Sanctions is not nearly as controversial a tool. And I think that's in many ways a good thing, because I think that these only work if we agree and our allies agree that they're good policy, and agree to execute them.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue to topic number two, which are some successful court challenges, which are obviously notable in this space because we don't see that many of them. However,
Exactly.
in late 2020 and early 2021, we saw quite a few of them, perhaps in response to maximum pressure and the way that the prior administration was handling its business in the space. So I'll toss it to Tim to start us off on that.
Yeah, so one of the things that has been really consistent over administrations until the last 4 years had been that when sanctions were imposed, there was a process, that there was an attempt to figure out the whether the culpable party was responsible. And I'm not saying they always got it right, and I'm not even saying that they were as efficient as they think they are, but they were trying to be efficient, and they were relatively efficient at identifying sanctions targets and targeting them for reasons that they could back up. I think that in the successful court challenges, and here we're talking about Xiaomi and Luokong and some of the other ones that were on the military list, that was originally put together by the Department of Defense under the Trump administration, under the executive order that started this program about communist Chinese military companies. Those designations were clearly, when challenged in court, done in such an amateur fashion. There really was no thought put into them. When they would try to justify them, there'd be a page memo, and even in that page, they would get facts wrong and have misspellings, and it was just such a clown show, I think, for lack of a better term, that those did become subject to lawsuits. I think in the same way, I mean, that policy was one that the Biden administration continued. It actually brought in OFAC to do the designations and kind of fine-tuned at the edges, but the International Criminal Court sanctions, that was just a clown show of a policy. Like, that was one that was just like pounding your fist on the table because you're mad at the International Criminal Court. But no one, I mean, had even conceived in my mind that they might be the subject of an executive order and an IEPA ban, which is why they had a tough time justifying it in court, because, once someone goes on the SDN list, dealing with them is almost impossible. And the idea that it was prohibited for U.S. persons to deal with investigators at the International Criminal Court. I mean, whether we have jurisdiction or not, the idea that you couldn't sit in a room with them without being worried that if you were telling them something that was useful to them, that you were providing them a service in violation of U.S. law, was very problematic, which is why before the Biden administration scrapped the program, a court in New York had issued a preliminary injunction striking it down on First Amendment grounds. And I think those lawsuits they exemplify just how far out there the previous administration's sanctions policy was in some areas. And I don't mean this as a partisan issue. I do think that sanctions are for the most part, very bipartisan. And there were laws that were passed in the Trump administration by Republican Congresses that President Trump threatened to veto. And I'm thinking of CATSA, really, when I talk about that as part of the last 4 years. But I think these latter programs were just either so poorly executed or so poorly conceived that they became the topic of litigation, and successful litigation, which we just don't see in this area that much.
Yeah, I would add to that one of our other favorite topics from 2020 that lingered on into early 2021, which is the TikTok ban and the WeChat ban. That was thrust upon the Commerce Department to implement, which went down in flames in court as well. And I think the most interesting thing so we discussed this at the time, which is, are these examples are they all going to be outliers ultimately in the grand scheme of things because of the approach that was taken by the Trump administration, and the fact that these were, by all accounts, kind of cram downs from the top to achieve, to do something that the agency maybe didn't even want to do, but was kind of forced to do from the politicals at the top of the heap. And are we going to see any replication of this going forward, or any similar exposure that future designations or future executive orders or other things have in the same way? I think the answer is likely no, but the caveat to that is, look, there's no guarantee that we won't end up with an administration that's going to take a similar approach again at some point in the future. So this is a bit of a roadmap for if and when that occurs. And secondly, there's good, pretty well developed and pretty well reasoned case law on this now that we have in a number of district courts that gives a roadmap to many parties who might be now taking a more serious look or perhaps a more nuanced look at how they could challenge these things in the future. In not necessarily even in these programs, but in any other kind of IEPA based action that the party's unhappy with. So I think that is kind of the lasting legacy of this is that we do have that. There's no erasing that or getting away from that. And so, it'll be interesting to see sort of in the future whether there are new wrinkles that develop from this or how these cases get cited or used in the future by parties who might be on the wrong side of some kind of government action that they feel is unjust and unsupported, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, and just one quick addition to that, because I agree. I think TikTok and WeChat are another good example of just kind of policies that were far enough out there that it's not surprising that the current administration pulled back from them. I do think that on the litigation issue, those cases make law that kind of stands in contrast with what we thought the earlier law was, and that is that when you read a decision pre 2016 of a court reviewing OFAC policies or CFIUS policies or entire executive order programs set up under IEPA like the ICC policy, like the ICC program was, what oozes off the page is the way the courts are deferential to them. I mean, it just reads like a different Administrative Procedure Act challenge or a different constitutional challenge in most of those cases than these did. You had a court that was kind of peeling back the onion in a way that courts often don't do here. And once courts start doing that, I think they get more comfortable doing that, even if it's a different set of facts. Now, I think these programs were so far out there as a legal matter that the courts, it wasn't that hard for them to do it here. But I will be interested to see, now that they've done it in these cases, whether they take a closer look at some of the other actions that OFAC or CFIUS or even the president takes with respect to other programs that are set up that seem to be on the margins or even are less far out on the margins, but are ones that might have problems.
Yeah, so let's leave that one behind for now. That's a fascinating one. Let's move to story number three, which is China, China, China. Um, not surprisingly, China remained at the fore of U.S. trade policy, U.S. sanctions policy. I would say there were not any, and anybody who's listened to the 20 or so episodes we recorded this year and posted, I think there's China content on every single one of them, but by and large. But I wouldn't say that, as opposed to last year when we saw some pretty significant new developments like the Hong Kong program, the Xinjiang program, the military and user rule and use rule that's mostly targeted at China, the Huawei foreign direct product rule being expanded, those types of things. We didn't really see any big seismic shifts. I think it was largely more of the same. It's largely, and obviously the sort of feeling out process between the Biden administration and the Chinese government throughout this year, we obviously discussed that quite a bit, and I think to some extent that's still happening. I am proud to say that we were correct in sort of foretelling and predicting that the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics from the U.S. was coming, because that is now in fact happening. So it'll be, that's just a little interesting kind of asterisk slash footnote to see sort of how that impacts U.S.-China relations. But obviously Taiwan is kind of one big area that we talked about some, where I think there is kind of brewing, gathering storm clouds, and we're not quite sure how that's going to play out going forward. I think by and large, I would say that the experience that Tim and I have had with discussing China-specific trade compliance issues with our clients is that this continues to be far and away kind of the number one concern that everybody has in terms of how they manage their relationships in China, whether it's supply chain related, customer related, or anything else. And it continues to be kind of the big issue that everybody has to wrestle with. I would also add as a shout out to our good friends Richard Mojica and Nate Langford, who joined us on an episode. the business and human rights aspects of dealing with China, and the increased and continued CBP enforcement on the WROs and other things targeted at certain products coming out of China is a massive issue that we are seeing frequently as well. And so these things all tie together. There is still, even though I don't think that we can say that there was any sort of seismic event that happened with respect to China this year. It continues to dominate and to be, I think, the number one biggest kind of substantive and certainly geographic issue on the US front, not surprisingly, across the board with respect to trade compliance. So
Yeah, I mean that is another. I think China exemplifies what we were saying in the last segment about how normally sanctions and export controls is a very consensus-driven, bipartisan subject.
it's the only
China,
thing. It's the only thing that Congress can agree on right now is that
to,
we need to impose more pain on China, or we need to erect more barriers to protect ourselves from China. Yeah.
and I'd say there's probably 75 to 80% overlap between what Biden has done in China and what Trump it was doing in China. I think some of the crazy programs like the Chinese military companies, or at least the way that it was crazily conceived at the
Have
at
been
the
cleaned
beginning
up.
and
Have been
implemented, have
cleaned
been
up,
cleaned up.
and yeah, yeah.
And then I do think that there is more in the Biden administration, and we'll talk about this in some of the other segments too. But the Biden administration has really focused trade policy on human rights in a way that the Trump administration didn't, or at least didn't do it to the same extent. I mean, global Magnitsky came into play under Trump, and so corruption-based sanctions came into play during the Trump administration, and a lot of the stuff that the Xinjiang program came into play during the Trump administration. The focus on Hong Kong came into play during the Trump administration. So all of that has continued in the Biden administration. I think there's been, at the margins, an increased focus on that stuff. But on China, the policy really, when you separate out that 10% of kind of the weird stuff, and the 10% that the Biden administration has probably doubled down on some of the human rights issues that the Trump administration also was concerned with and imposed sanctions programs for. It's really a lot. It's the continuity is pretty shocking for two presidents who, on the surface, could not seem more different.
Yeah, I will say also, we largely expected that. I think our
Right.
discussions around the time of the transition were that there is not going to be drastic change when it comes to China policy, and that has been the case. And again, don't expect that there's going to be big shifts or a big drop off. And if anything, it will continue to sort of expand, kind of organically over time as we're sort of seeing it progress now. So we could talk about China for another hour. That's not in the
Right.
spirit of the lightning round fashion of this episode. So
Not be lightning quick.
we will stop there, and let's go to story number 4, which is JCPOA 2.0 is dead. Long live JCPOA 2.0.
Right. I mean, so this is a frustrating story because they ran on this issue, each of them, and they were supposed to be at polar opposites. But as we get to the end of 2021, Iran policy is almost exactly the same as it was at the end of 2020. And that is that the renewed maximum pressure sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration are still in play. The Biden administration has committed to return to the JCPOA, but they need Iran to commit to make the nuclear commitments. Iran, at least publicly, has said they're ready to make the nuclear commitments, but only after the sanctions are lifted. And we've been at an impasse pretty much since the beginning of the Biden administration. And we've talked about this, on the podcast a number of times. A ticking clock is a bad thing for these negotiations, because as we get closer to 2022 and an election year, and as you get closer to the end of the JCPOA, at least nominally, each day that passes, you get closer to the temporary suspension of commitments. Some of them end as soon as 2025. The chances for a deal become slimmer and slimmer. And I think what I'm hearing, and I think what you're hearing, is the chances are, it's pretty much dead.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the striking thing is, and again, for anybody who listens to us regularly will know, I think we had an episode titled "Is JCPOA 2.0 upon us?" or something like that back in the
Right.
early part of this year, because it certainly looked like, and all the signals seemed to be there, that this was going to happen.
Right.
And we know and have heard for a fact that the gears of the U.S. government were ready to go, and we're starting to think about guidance to and taking people off the SDN list and all the steps that would have need to be taken for the sanctions relief piece of that. And then it just kind of hit a lull and then kind of hit a wall. And then with Raisi coming in Iran and everything and the continued efforts to with enrichment in Iran and the games that are being played with the nuclear inspectors, I think at this point I wouldn't say it's a 0% chance that it ever happens, but it is really, really low. It is probably less than 10% in my view as to whether this could ever happen at this point.
It's so astounding to me because you have all the parties who I actually genuinely believe would like back into the deal for different reasons. But I mean, we have all the allies, all of the countries that were, parties to the JCPOA to begin with, that include Russia and China. They all want the JCPOA to go back into play. Our administration ran on the JCPOA coming back into play, and Iran for different reasons. I think Iran economically it would like to have the sanctions lifted, and I think they want it nearly bad enough to make the sort of concessions that they made originally in the JCPOA, but it's not going to happen. And it is kind of astounding that when everybody wants back in, that and everybody's in agreement that the deal should go back into play, that it won't. But I'm now convinced that that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah. So with that, let's throw a little bit of dirt, maybe not all of the dirt, but most of the dirt on JCPOA 2.0, and let's move to story number 5, which is virtual currency and ransomware. This is a topic that we have covered quite a bit, and in part because it has become a priority issue, not just for OFAC, but for the Justice Department as well. I think this is, it's kind of fascinating to see because there's been this kind of confluence of factors that have led to this, which is, and we've seen obviously, and we've talked about quite a bit, the guidance that's been issued on the compliance guidance that's been issued jointly across agencies in the USG with respect to dealing with virtual currency, with respect to ransomware attacks and potential ransomware payments. And I think it's the sort of rise of virtual currency platforms generally that has been kind of steadily increasing. And I don't want to say that it kind of jumped the shark this year or hit a tipping point, but it's certainly matured to a level that we are seeing and hearing about it more. It's becoming a much higher priority concern for U.S. regulators across the board. Not just not just Justice and OFAC, but also SEC and other agencies in other areas as well. So there's that piece, and then there's also the ransomware epidemic and the ransomware attack epidemic, and the fact that there were some high-profile ransomware payments that were made in connection with some of these attacks earlier this year, which I think again kind of aligned to make this a bit of a moment for these issues. And of course, DOJ has now stood up a task force essentially to prioritize this. There have been a few high-profile prosecutions that have been announced recently in connection with these types of attacks, and actors who have been working on the back end to sort of facilitate payments via virtual currency for ransomware actors and malicious cyber actors. So I think this is just, in some ways, I think this is here to stay. In my view, this is not going to be something that kind of fades as a fad. I think everybody needs to understand what you're dealing with here. And to the extent anybody out there is not yet educating themselves on how to think about these issues and how to interact with these issues, whether it be just being prepared for a ransomware attack, what to do if you are subject to a ransomware attack, what to do if you are having to interface with a virtual wallet or a virtual currency exchange, or start transacting in virtual currencies. I would certainly encourage anyone out there to be school themselves up on the compliance aspects of that, not just from the sanctions standpoint, but across the board, and to really be getting your eyes open to all of the kind of the pros and cons of that, and all the risks that go along with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think when we get to year end 2022, this will still be on the agenda, because I think, as we've seen this year, OFAC has moved on this issue from a, like, be careful, to a, you better talk to law enforcement before you make the payments, because if you make payments and haven't talked to law enforcement and they go to sanction people, we're going to be really mad. Whereas if you've talked to law enforcement and you make a mistake, you're going to be fine, which is not exactly what they've said, but the gist of what they've said. They've evolved on that, but the trick, as I see it, is, if you can't prevent ransomware attacks from big infrastructures like gas pipelines, it's very hard for me to see how it would be in everyone's interest to then just say, to deter ransomware attacks, just shut down the gas network in the southeast of the United States for months or years, just to show the ransomware attackers that we're not going to give in to them. So the payments sometimes are, unfortunately necessary, and how you make those payments is, I think, going to be the subject of continuing discussion, or unless, somehow one comes up with a magic bullet that stops these attacks altogether from working.
Right. I mean, the USG is definitely now putting its thumb on the scale of don't pay,
Right.
whereas I think they were trying to be a little more agnostic previously, and now it's kind of squarely on the don't pay side of things. And if you do pay, be aware that you could get yourself in a lot of hot water. So it is fascinating how that's evolved over the last several years, from the time when I was in government talking about these issues as they were becoming more pronounced and more serious, and so it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here, but definitely not something that's going away. And so, speaking of which, good segue, because story
Yep.
number 6 is a hotbed of these issues, and that's our friends in Russia. And so let's
Yeah.
let's get into Russia for a minute.
Well, so let's get into Russia. So the Russian sanctions exist from 2014 because the Russian government under Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine. It basically has now it controls the territory in Crimea, has occupied Crimea, depending upon whether you take the Russian side or the U.S. side. The Russians say they have liberated Crimea. The rest of the world would say occupied. But in any event, that's the history, and history, past is prologue. And so what we end 2021 with is Russian forces kind of massed along the Ukraine border, and by many accounts prepared to invade again. And so a lot of us have been giving thought to, well, okay, so say that happens, what happens to sanctions? And I think, for 2022, it won't surprise me if the worst happens in Ukraine, to see an expansion of the SSI sanctions, maybe some of the sectors that are currently subject of the SSI sanctions, like energy and finance, they either become SDNs, or, for example, in the energy sector, the sanctions only apply to certain oil projects, offshore, deep water, Arctic, and shale, and those sanctions could be expanded to other projects that have Russian input. There could be, those energy sectors are mostly SSIs. They could become SDNs. The same with the Russian banks. I mean, there's a lot of ways to increase pressure on Russia by moving companies and individuals from the SSI list to the SDN list. In the same way, there's a list of oligarchs. How thoroughly that list was put together back in 2017 under Katza has been the subject of some debate, but all of the oligarchs weren't sanctioned or weren't put on the SDN list. In fact,
barely,
most of them
barely any of them
were.
were. Barely any of them
Right.
were.
And
Yeah.
so that's another area where you'd expect to see kind of some expansion. And then you'd expect to potentially see the sanctions move to other sectors of the Russian economy, because there are at least some executive orders that would allow that haven't really been put into force at this point.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go out on a limb, which is not much of a limb, to say that if anybody's out there betting on an area of U.S. sanctions policy that might get a little spicier in 2022, Russia's a good bet. And for the reason that Tim cited, the military buildup on the Ukrainian border is, that is literally and figuratively a powder keg, and who knows how that's going to play out. And that's not even accounting for all the other things that have already happened this year, with the U.S. trying to reassert a little bit of backbone with respect to Russia that perhaps was lost in the prior administration, and that's pushing back against malicious cyber activity, election interference, of course, the treatment of Alexei Navalny, Nord Stream
Nord
2.
Stream 2, too.
Yeah, all of
Yeah.
those things, right? And we saw a number of actions. We saw a new executive order. We saw other things throughout the year that went to addressing those issues, and now we're back to sort of first principles, and we're back to Ukraine again. And yeah, I just think this is, again, I mentioned earlier that I think China remains kind of the most, in some ways, the most challenging, most fraught kind of geographic area country to do business. Certainly for U.S. companies, or companies that have any kind of U.S. Presence whatsoever, or have to comply with U.S. laws. But I mean, Russia is a close second in many ways, and the program in Russia, the sanctions program, is already fairly complex and could get more complex depending on what plays out in the next few months. So yeah, that's, keep your eye on Russia, and yeah, who knows what's coming in 2022 there.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it could get easier. They could just embargo Russia, but
Right.
I don't think, which would make it a lot simpler to navigate because you mostly couldn't. But I think
As
that
we as we
that's
know,
unlikely.
because of the deep economic ties, I think that's probably not ever going to
Right.
happen. But same with China. But yeah, we'll see. We'll
We'll
see. It
see.
could get interesting. So let's leave Russia and let's move to story number 7, which in our outline, we termed turbulent times equal lots of new sanctions programs and lots of new sanctions period. So indeed, we have spent a lot of time this year talking about. We've talked about far too many coups and attempted coups, and we've talked about sort of political malfeasance, stealing elections, and anti-democratic activities, and actions that are just blatantly contrary to human rights and humanitarian concerns. And as a result, we've ended up with a new sanctions program in Burma. We've ended up with a new Ethiopia related sanctions program. We've ended up with, obviously, the situation in Afghanistan has not led to a new program per se, but there has had to be a lot of focus on how to deal with that, in with Taliban regaining control of the government there, Yemen, Belarus, and on and on and on. There's many other examples here. So I think, in addition to our kind of old favorites, so to speak, I think there's just been, and again, this kind of flies in the face of the idea that the new sort of quote unquote new approach under the Biden administration to how sanctions are going to be administered means less activity or less compliance concerns. Not necessarily. There's still a lot going on. There's still a lot of new programs, a lot of new consideration, most of which, of course, are just a byproduct of world events and political events that are completely out of the control of the US government. But nevertheless, there is a lot that has happened this year and a lot that has changed this year as a result, and certainly has kept us on our toes throughout the year. And I know many of our clients and many of our friends who are fellow trade nerds who spend a lot of time worrying about these things and talking about these things as well. So that's really it, just to kind of remark on that, because there has been, in some ways, an astounding amount of activity and churn and developments that have led to new programs, expanded programs, revitalized programs, across the board.
Yeah, what the only thing I have to add to that is, like, in a lot of these programs, I think the new administration, they're not that new anymore since we're a year in, but the Biden administration has tried to um, gauge the sanctions to prevent collateral consequences in a way that we didn't see as much in the past administration. I think Yemen is a good example. They came in and really changed the way that the Trump administration had gone after the what the one of the fighting parties in Yemen. The Trump had put them on the SDN list as a group, and the Biden administration pulled back from that. You see it in Afghanistan, Burma, Ethiopia is another great example of how they tried to tweak the sanctions to try and prevent collateral consequences. We'll see if it works, because I think they're trying to get humanitarian aid through in all these countries because they're all war-torn countries that have just come off a coup. Whether or not that succeeds is going to be another question, but they're trying in a way that the previous administration really didn't seem to be.
And they're trying to change behavior, and they're trying to marshal multilateral support from allies to actually affect change in pretty much all of the places that we mentioned. So, right, time will tell. We've said this over and over again. Time will tell whether this is going to work. We're not sort of touting this as a success necessarily. We're just acknowledging that it is a slightly different approach, and the proof will be in the pudding, so to speak, once we have a little more data and a little more time to see how this all plays out. So anyway, let's leave that one behind. Let's now move back to the courtroom, and let's go to, again, one of our favorite topics in a resolution that was, has already started to have some ripple effects as we predicted, and I think will continue to in the future, and that's the DPA that was reached that allowed Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou to leave Canada and return to China.
Yeah, talk about kind of a letdown of an ending, but one that I think was pretty much inevitable in this set of circumstances, and I'm sure that the biggest beneficiary of this settlement is Canada, and that they're very relieved that this all took place. I mean, it started with this dramatic arrest of the CFO in Huawei as she was transiting Canada on a flight back to China, so that she was arrested at the request of the U.S. government, so that she could be extradited to the U.S. to face charges in New York related to violations of the Iran sanctions. But there were also claims that she had misled a financial institution about the business that Huawei was doing in Iran, and there were extradition proceedings that seemed to be taking quite a while, and some of the issues were relatively serious. And so in that setting, and also I guess I should mention the fact that China had arrested two Canadian citizens after the arrest of Mrs. Meng, and was basically holding them and trying them until until the charges against Mrs. Meng were resolved, or the extradition proceedings were resolved. So you essentially had Canada conducting extradition proceedings with a gun to its head. Um, all of that resolved earlier this year when Mrs. Meng entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, the terms of which is she got to go home to China. She's not supervised in any way, but she signed a 4-page statement of facts that admitted to bank fraud. And they can use that against her if she ever violates her DPA and becomes subject to arrest. But given that it's not supervised and that she's in China, and I would guess unlikely to leave to a country with an extradition treaty with the U.S., at least while that DPA is in place, I think that the chances that we hear anything more about this DPA going forward are close to zero.
Yeah, I think to me the biggest takeaway, and we talked about this at the time that the deal was reached, is the statement that she signed is presumably now going to be a centerpiece of the United States government's case against Huawei the company, which is still pending, and how that gets put into play is a fascinating question, and what can be made of that is a even more fascinating question. I think a couple things, just kind of food for thought here. I have no insight on this other than my own musings, but um, with the new kind of corporate enforcement push at DOJ, which is well acknowledged and has been touted from DOJ leadership in the past few months, I remain very curious to see whether, if there's a resolution reached with Huawei, which no guarantee there will be because they certainly have not shown an inclination to negotiate meaningfully with the U.S. government, will they insist on a monitor, and how extensive will that resolution be? I think that's a fascinating question. Number one. Number two, one thing that we haven't talked about in a long time, which I will throw out there, is could OFAC put Huawei on the SDN list? I mean, that is in some ways the nuclear option, more punishing in some ways than a monitorship and whatever criminal penalty they would have to pay, monetary penalty they'd have to pay, obviously. With the entity listing and the expansion of the entity listing to cover, the and expand the foreign direct product rule. I think around that time last year, we speculated whether or not that was in play, and honestly, under the prior administration, I think it probably was being discussed whether that would ever be palatable to the current administration. I don't know, but in the event that Huawei was not going to play ball in the ongoing prosecution, and if there was really a desire to kind of take Huawei out at the knees, even more so than has been done to date with the entity listing, because of the threat they pose, according to the government, to U.S. national security, SDN list, right? I mean, that's the nuclear option. I
It's
think
still there.
that remains a fascinating question. I think people should, look again. I'm not handicapping the likelihood of that. I think it's still probably very unlikely that that were ever to happen, but we'll put it out there, and don't quote us on having any insight onto that other than our own, our own just kind of wild ideas. But yeah, I think that's again just sort of a fascinating kind of connected point with the resolution with Mrs. Meng in terms of what this could foretell for Huawei and how that case gets resolved or doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, we're not there yet, but I definitely could see a scenario in which, some leverage is needed over Huawei, and that gets put back on the table. But
Yep.
all
Yep.
right, so that's something that I think will be talked about next year. Let's talk about three
Yes.
countries that we haven't talked about at all this year.
Yes. So the so-called the John Bolton Troika of tyranny, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, which was on the agenda last year with good reason because there had been a lot of action last year. And we spent a lot of time at the early part of this year thinking about and talking about whether the Biden administration was going to really deviate policy wise from how it's going to treat these countries, especially Cuba and Venezuela, which have been at the fore of U.S. sanctions policy and enforcement for the last several years. And as Tim said, things have been relatively quiet. There have been no seismic changes. There has been very little that has been done here, and I think that is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, other than I would say when we saw the actions that were taken in connection with the Cuban government crackdown on pro-democratic protesters. We
Agreed.
did see that. We did talk about that. We did wonder whether that was a prelude to more. There hasn't really been more yet that has been done in that regard, but certainly that's an area and an issue to keep an eye on. But with respect to Venezuela in particular, which I would say in many ways was being held up almost as co-equal in the sort of on the naughty list with like Iran under the Trump administration, and the actions that were being taken clearly meant to try to pressure Maduro to sort of his power base to crumble, which just did not work. And so the approach has certainly been, the rhetoric continues to be tough, but the approach certainly has not been a maximum pressure approach with Venezuela. And so, other than a couple of instances where former Maduro, advisors and cronies have been in the news for their criminal proceedings, and we talked about the extradition recently and the reaction that they had there in Venezuela. But otherwise, things have been relatively quiet, and we have not heard much, Sarah. So I guess I throw to you, Tim. What do you make of that, and what do we think is coming, given that we've had a relatively quiet first year on this front across the board with these countries?
Yeah, I think that the approach to all three countries is pretty much the same, which is the administration would prefer just not to do anything in those countries unless events force them to do otherwise. So I think that describes what happened with when the pro democracy protests started and then the Cuban government cracked down. We saw some action from the administration there. When a close ally of President Maduro is extradited, we saw action there, but I think that was an extradition that was I think we don't know all of the facts behind that extradition, and I think that kind of you can put that into a box and say that was not kind of a policy development, that was just an opportunistic development. And in Nicaragua, I think the same way. I mean, there's a little bit of action there in terms of enforcing sanctions enforcement, but it's very minimal. It does not.
Adding to the list of designations, kind of incrementally or sort of periodically. But yeah, beyond
And
that,
none
not
of
that
the
much.
rhetoric, that we saw. I mean, from the
Yeah.
Trump administration, these three were equated as communist havens and real enemies of U.S. democracy. In the Biden administration, there's none of that rhetoric, and really not very much action. I mean, Venezuela enforcement under Trump was it was close to Iran in terms of the naughty list, and it's just it's not the same thing now. You just don't see much and hear much about Venezuela. I suspect that there are things going on behind the scenes, but I think those countries have been much more left to diplomacy, except when circumstances force otherwise, than they were under the Trump administration.
Right. No, I think that's a good way to think of it. So, fascinating to see what may materialize going forward with those countries, which are obviously relatively close neighbors of the U.S. and are quite consequential in terms of a whole host of different issues and interests that the U.S. has in the region. But yeah, not. I think maybe a little surprising that it has been so quiet in the first year under the Biden administration. So we shall see going forward. With that, we're flying through here by our standards, and we're at story number 10, which is as I said at the outset, it's kind of the flip of, if we started with the hitting the reset button and the kind of the shift in the philosophical approach to how sanctions are administered. This is kind of the shift, perhaps, or the redefining of the substantive lodestar for some of the sanctions administration and enforcement, and specifically relating to anti-corruption, democracy, and humanitarian rights. So I will human rights. So I will throw that to Tim to chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of touched on it already, but I think if you could have a theme for the Biden administration sanctions policy in its first year and then compare it to the Trump administration, I think that the big difference would be the emphasis of the Biden administration on use of sanctions for anti-corruption purposes, use of sanctions for human rights purposes, use of sanctions for pro-democracy purposes. That's not to say that wasn't done in the Trump administration. It was. But I think that the emphasis and the focus on that as a basis for sanctions is new and different, and really is what I would say distinguishes the new administration's policy 1 year in.
Yeah, it is a tonal shift, a marked tonal shift, I think, from what we saw in the last administration. I would also point to, and I'm not quite sure, I can't quite recall how much time we spent talking about this at the time, but obviously in June of this year, there was the memorandum that was issued by the White House that was, kind of declaring anti-corruption and fighting corruption globally was a core national security interest of the United States, which frankly has always been the case, but the idea that something that sort of high profile and pronounced would be released is notable, and as Tim said, with global Magnitsky authorities at the disposal of OFAC, that is a big stick to go after folks globally. And so I do think, not just, again, that's not to say that there was not anything being done on these fronts under the prior administration. There certainly was. I think we may have observed, and others may have observed, that perhaps cynically that was being done, perhaps with a bit of a cynical edge to it, and not necessarily as a core kind of tenet of the administration's policies. But I think now, clearly, in addition to all the other things that we talked about with respect to, the usual suspects, the Chinas, the Irans of the world, and sort of, anti-proliferation and anti-terrorism and other types of core national security tenets. I think these additional bases have been elevated to some degree, at least in the messaging and the rhetoric, if not in the execution. I do think in the execution as well, and
Well,
I think that is something that we should expect to see continue going forward.
Well, I wanted to say something about that. So I can give you the anecdotal, but I think maybe in 2022 we will give you the data. We can have some of our crack associates that work with us here in our trade group put together some statistics, because it sure seems to me, as we get the emails from OFAC periodically, a couple times a week, sometimes more than a couple times a week, that when I read them as they come in, there's a lot more of them that are global Magnitsky sanctions. I get the sense that this is happening 2 or 3 times a week now, in a way that just wasn't happening under previously. And I haven't done the data, and I think we should, because I think it would be interesting to see, how many global Magnitsky sanctions have been imposed in the last year compared to how many were imposed in the year before that. My sense is it's a lot more, but I'd like to see the data, and in 2022 we'll go from anecdote to data, which is usually a good way to assess situations.
We are a data-driven operation. We are not a let's pull let's pull this out of the clouds operation here at Miller and Chevalier. So with that, that's our top 10. So honorable mentions. Any sort of odds and ends that you want to mention that we didn't cover in depth? Any topics, any issues, any countries, anything else?
No, I mean, we haven't talked about North Korea. We haven't talked about Syria. There's some enforcement going on in both of those places, but I think that's a topic for next year. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll just mention two things real quick. So one I mentioned, which is kind of the DOJ, enforcement focus, which they in addition to some of the other pronouncements that have been made on sort of general corporate crime, there have been some statements made by senior leadership at DOJ about the strong pipeline of sanctions and export controls cases that they're in the process of investigating and prosecuting. So I would keep an eye on that. Frankly, there's always a pretty long pipeline there, so I don't know how different that is, but the messaging is certainly suggesting that there is going to be ample resources put behind trying to bring some more of those cases and publicize those cases. So keep an eye on that. And then, interestingly, just this week, I will just mention this as kind of a final thought, a new executive order that came out relating to the illicit drug trade, which is not a new program. It's kind of filling gaps in that are already covered by the Kingpin Act and related authorities and some of the other counter narcotics authorities that exist for OFAC to deploy. But this is largely, if you read any of the messaging on this is largely meant to help counteract the effects of the opioid crisis. And so it's sort of an interesting development. I mean, again, just sort of underscores the fact that, sanctions authorities and IEPA-based authorities are kind of limitless in some ways, that they can be deployed and used to, combat just about any problem that is deemed to be a national security threat to the United States. And this is kind of another example of that. Just announced this week, just initial set of designations related to that. So if folks aren't following that, I would certainly encourage you to take a quick look at that. But another kind of fascinating footnote that kind of plays into the other things we've seen this year and talked about today.
Food for thought for next year.
Food for thought for next year. Okay, so with that, I think we are wrapped for 2021, and it has been a wild ride. But Mr. O'Toole, always a pleasure to do this with you, and very happy that I have you to talk about this stuff with, on whether on air or off air, to help sort out the thornier issues that we have to deal with on a daily basis. But to everybody out there, hope everyone is going to get some rest. Whatever holidays you celebrate, have a happy holiday season, have a happy new year, and we look forward to coming back to see you all again in 22. Until then, stay safe and stay sanctions free.
Yeah, I also wanted to say it really has been, a pleasure to talk with you about these sort of things over the past year. I'm glad I have you as a friend and colleague, Brian. And if people who are listening thought that we talked for a long time on these podcasts, they should hear our discussions off these podcasts, because this is the edited version. Anyhow, stay sanctions free, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.